Chapter 3 of Top of the Ladder, Marine Operations in the Northern Solomons by John C. Chapin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Diversionary landings. There was another key element in the American plan, diversion. To mislead the enemy on the real objective, Bougainville, the IMAC operations order on 15 October directed the 8th Brigade Group of the 3rd New Zealand Division to land on the Treasury Islands, 75 miles southeast of Empress Augusta Bay. There, on 27 October, the New Zealanders, under Brigadier R.A. Rowe, with 1,900 Marine support troops, went ashore on 2 small islands. One was named Mono and the other Sterling. Mono is about 4 miles wide, north to south, and 7 miles long. It looks like a pancake. Sterling, shaped like a hook, is 4 miles long, narrow in places to 300 yards, but with plenty of room on its margins for airstrips. In a drizzly overcast, the 29th NZ Battalion, Lieutenant Colonel F.L.H. Davis, and the 36th, Lieutenant Colonel K.B. Mackenzie Mearson, hit Mono at Falamy Point, and the 34th, under Lieutenant Colonel R.J. Iyer, struck the beach of Sterling Island off Blanche Harbor. There was light opposition. Help for the assault troops came from LCI, Landing Craft Infantry, gunboats which knocked out at least one deadly Japanese 40mm twin-mount gun and a couple of enemy bunkers. A simultaneous landing was then made on the opposite or north side of Mono Island at Sonotalu. This was perhaps the most important landing of all, for there New Zealand soldiers, American Seabees, and U.S. radar specialists would set up a big long-range radar station. The Japanese soon reacted to the Sonotalu landing and hurled themselves against the perimeter. On one occasion, 80 to 90 Japanese attacked 50 New Zealanders who waited until they saw the whites of their eyes. They killed 40 of the Japanese and dispersed the rest. There was unexpected machine gun fire at Sterling. One CB bulldozer operator attacked the machine gun with his big blade. An Army corporal, a medic, said he couldn't believe it. The CB ran his dozer over and over the machine gun nest until everything was quiet. It all began to stink after a couple of days. Outmanned, the Japanese drew back to higher ground, were hunted down, and killed. Surrender was still not in their book. On 12 November, the New Zealanders could call the treasuries their own with the radar station in operation. Japanese dead totaled 205, and the brigade took only 8 prisoners. The operation had secured the seaside flank of Bougainville, and very soon on Sterling there was an airfield. It began to operate against enemy forces on Bougainville on Christmas Day, 1943. A second diversion, east of the Treasury Islands and 45 miles from Bougainville, took place on Chesul Island. Sub-Lieutenant C.W. Seaton, Royal Australian Navy and Coast Watcher on Chesul, said the Japanese there appeared worried. The garrison troops were shooting at their own shadows, perhaps because American and Australian patrols had been crisscrossing the 80 miles long, 20 miles wide island since September, scouting out the Japanese positions. There were also some 3,500 transient enemy troops on Chesul, bivouacked and waiting to be shipped the 45 miles north to Buin on Bougainville, where there was already a major Japanese garrison force. Uncertainty about the American threat of invasion somewhere was enough to make the Japanese, especially Vice Admiral Junichi Kusaka, commander, Southeast Area Fleet, at Rabaul, jittery. It was he who wanted much of the Japanese 17th Army concentrated at Buin, for, he thought, the Allies might strike there. General Vandergrift wanted to be sure that the Japanese were focused on Buin. So on 20 October, he called in Lieutenant Colonel Robert H. Williams, commanding the 1st Parachute Regiment, and Lieutenant Colonel Victor H. Krulak, commanding its 2nd Battalion. "Get ashore on Chesul," the general ordered, "and stir up the biggest commotion possible. Make sure they think the invasion has commenced." It was a most unusual raid. 656 men, a handful of native guides, and an Australian coast watcher with a road map. The Navy took Krulak's reinforced battalion of parachutists to a beach site near a hamlet called Voza. That would be the CP, command post, location for the duration. The troops slipped ashore on 28 October at 0021 and soon had all their gear concealed in the bush. By daylight, the Marines had established a base on a high jungle plateau in the Voza area. The Japanese soon spotted the intruders, sent a few fighter planes to rake the beach, but that did no harm. They did not see the 4 small landing craft which Krulak had brought along and hidden among some mangroves with their Navy crews on call. Krulak then outlined 2 targets. 8 miles south from their CP at Voza, there was a large enemy barge base near the Vagera River. The Australians said some 150 Japanese were there. The other objective was an enemy outpost in the opposite direction, 17 miles north on the Warrior River. Then Krulak took his operations officer, Major Tolson A. Smoke, 17 men, and a few natives as scouts, and headed for the barge basin. On the way, 10 unlucky Japanese were encountered unloading a barge. The Marines opened fire, killing 7 of them and sinking the barge. After reconnoitering the main objective, the barge basin, the patrol returned to Voza. The following morning, Krulak sent a patrol near the barge basin to the Vagera River for security and then to wave in his small landing craft, bringing up his troops to attack. But, back at Voza, along came a flight of American planes which shot up the Marines and sank one of their vital boats. Now Krulak's attack would have to walk to the village of Sangigai by the Japanese barge basin. To soften up Sangigai, Krulak called in 26 fighters escorting 12 torpedo bombers. They dropped 2 tons of bombs, and it looked for all the world like a real invasion. Krulak then sent a company to attack the basin from the beach, and another company with rifles, machine guns, rockets, and mortars to get behind the barge center. It was a pincer, and it worked. The Marines attacked at 1400 on 30 October. What the battle didn't destroy, the Marines blew up. The Japanese lost 72 dead. The Marines, 4 killed and 12 wounded. All was not so well in the other direction. Major Warner T. Bigger, Krulak's executive officer, had been sent north with 87 Marines toward the big emplacement on Chesul Bay near the Warrior River. His mission was to destroy, first the emplacement, with Guppy Island just offshore and fat with supplies as his secondary target. Bigger got to the Warrior River, but his landing craft became stuck in the shallows, so he brought them to a nearby cove, hid them in the jungle, and proceeded on foot north to Chesul Bay. Soon his scouts said that they were lost. It was late in the day, so Bigger bivouacked for the night. He sent a patrol back to the Warrior where it found a Japanese force. Slipping stealthily by them, the patrol got back to Voza. This led Krulak to call for fighter cover and PT boats to try to get up and withdraw Bigger. But Bigger didn't know he was in trouble, and he went ahead and blasted Guppy Island with mortars, because he couldn't get to the main enemy emplacement. When Bigger and his men barely got back to the Warrior River, there were no rescue boats, but there were plenty of Japanese. As the men waited tensely, the rescue boats came at the last moment, the very last. Thankfully, the men scrambled on board under enemy fire. Then 2 PT boats arrived, gun blazing, and provided cover so Bigger's patrol could get back to Voza. One of the PT boats was commanded by Lieutenant John F. Kennedy, U.S. Navy, later the President of the United States, who took 55 Marines on board when their escape boat sank. Krulak had already used up all his time and luck. The Japanese were now on top of him, their commanders particularly chagrined that they had been fooled, for the big landing had already occurred at Empress Augusta Bay. Krulak had to get out. Coast Watcher Seaton said there was not much time. On the night of 3 November, 3 LCIs rendezvoused off Voza. Krulak gave all his rations to the natives as the Marines boarded the LCIs. They could hear their mines and booby traps exploding to delay the Japanese. Within hours after the departure, a strong Japanese pincer snapped shut around the Voza encampment, but the Marines had gone, having suffered 9 killed, 15 wounded, and 2 missing, but leaving at least 143 enemy dead on Chesul. Sidebar: The Coast Watchers. It was on Bougainville, as well as on other islands of the Solomons chain, that the Australian Coast Watchers played their most decisive role in transmitting vital advance warnings to Allied forces in the lower Solomon Islands. Japanese warplanes and ships summoned in urgency to smash the beachhead at Guadalcanal had to pass over Bougainville, the big island in the middle of the route from Rabaul. Paul Mason, short, bespectacled, soft-spoken, held an eyrie in the South Mountains over Buin, and dark, wiry W.J. Jack Reed watched the ship and aircraft movements of the Japanese in and around Buka in the north. One memorable Mason wireless dispatch: 25 torpedo bombers headed yours. The message cost the Japanese Imperial Navy every one of those airplanes, save one. Reed reported a dozen or so Japanese transports assembling at Buka before their trip to Guadalcanal, with enough troops loaded on board to take the island back. All of the transports were lost or beached under the fierce attack of U.S. warplanes. In 1941, as the war with Japan commenced, there were 100 Coast Watchers in the Solomons. There were 10 times that number as the war ended, later including Americans. Assembled first as a tight group of island veterans in 1939, although there had been Coast Watchers after World War I, under Lieutenant Commander A. Eric Felt, Royal Australian Navy, their job was to cover about 500,000 miles of land, sea, and air. The very first moves of the Japanese on Guadalcanal were observed by Coast Watchers in the surrounding hills. The Coast Watchers could count the Japanese hammer strokes, almost see the nails. When the Japanese began the airfield, later to be called Henderson Field, the report of the Coast Watchers went all the way up to the American Joint Chiefs of Staff and across the desk of Admiral Ernest J. King, Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Fleet. Later, General Alexander A. Vandergrift on Guadalcanal banked heavily on the intelligence coming in from the radios of the Coast Watchers. The attacks on the treasuries and Chesul were based on the information provided them. On New Georgia, long before Americans decided to take it, a Coast Watcher had set up a haven for downed Allied pilots. And if the Americans needed a captured Japanese officer or soldier for interrogation, the local scouts were often able to provide one. The key to coast watching was the teleradio or wireless, good to 600 miles by key, 400 by voice. Cumbersome, heavy, the set took more than a dozen men to carry it, an indication of how much the Allies depended upon the local natives. The risks were great. Death would come after torture, but Mason recalled the risk was worth it, seeing the sleek, orderly formations heading for Guadalcanal, then limping back home with gaping holes in their hulls. Mason and Reed were highly decorated by both the Australians and the Americans for their vital services. End of chapter 3.